Hello, thank you very much for joining today. A very exciting presentation to share with you on something that's incredibly important to every subscription business. And some really impactful insights that tie to the drivers of company success or subscription profits. So today's session, we're going to dive into a topic that I think will be interesting to everybody, which is path to growth. And what the insight that we're going to share is that if you want to grow profits in any meaningful way, grow your profit line 10, 20% this calendar year, there's literally only one path you can take. Explain what that means and prove why that is the case for you today. So I am Steve Aronsoff. I am the Senior Vice President of Marketing at FlexPay, and let's get started. So we're going to go through a quick review of the subscription industry and how it's unfolded over the last couple of years and some of the dynamics that have accelerated the growth and adoption of subscriptions and some of the challenges and headwinds that we're now facing. We're also going to go through a review of subscription accounting, which I know sounds daunting and unpleasant, but in reality, it's going to be a ton of fun. We're going to be able to look at the numbers and in a very easy way understand what are the actions that you can take that will have a clear impact on your profit. And then go through one example of a way to be able to accomplish this, unlock the profit growth in your business. And that promise that we made at the beginning, which is unlock profitability this calendar year, we're going to give you the path to doing that. And give you a chance to ask some questions at the end. So let's get started. So we know that we've been operating a little bit in the golden age of subscriptions, right? Subscriptions were continuously growing over the last 10 years. Businesses found a lot of interest in the model because the consistent revenue delivery, and consumers and businesses that adopted subscriptions loved the regular delivery services. But then COVID happened, and what that created was an intense growth and adoption by both businesses and consumers in subscriptions because they had a need to be able to get access to products and services immediately. So it drove an enormous amount of subscriber growth, and of course that led to increased profits and adoption by the business. Now, during this period, at the same time, which is super interesting and it cannot be ignored, is that the governments around the world were driving fiscal stimulus programs, which was creating the cash availability in business in economies. And what that meant was that effectively the cost of cash was zero. Why is that important? That's important because it meant that a lot of businesses started investing in subscriptions, both launching new subscriptions to meet the consumer and business demand. Businesses that had traditional transactional selling models, because of their both the combination of now they couldn't get access to their customers through physical transactions and this access to easy cash, invested in growing more subscription product and service delivery. And because cash was largely free at this time, it really lowered the barrier of entry, and it really unlocked a lot of investment being made in customer acquisition. And at that point, the mantra for these businesses literally was grow at all costs. The metric that mattered was how many new subscribers are you adding, and the retention was important, but was never given the same amount of focus. Now, let's talk about where we are today, though, because things have certainly shifted, right? The easy cash is done. Over the last year, governments around the world have been raising interest rates. The cost of cash has increased. And of course, the availability of cash from investors has dropped dramatically. At the same time, the cost of acquiring new customers has increased fairly dramatically. What you've seen is that acquisition rates have slowed. The media to buy new customers has increased. And compounding that is the fact that particularly the consumer side, as inflation has increased and has made it more difficult to balance household budgets, consumers had to make hard choices of where they kept subscriptions and where they canceled. And the impact of that has created is that voluntary churn, has increased, meaning that churn rates overall have started to increase for subscription businesses. So you have this dual challenge of it's getting harder and more expensive to acquire new customers, and yet your customers are leaving at an ever-increasing pace. So as I talked about, the environment has changed. We entered into this period when cash was largely inexpensive to a growth at all costs mantra. And now the demands of businesses has also changed dramatically. Businesses across the spectrum, including subscription businesses, are now being asked, in fact demanded, to deliver profitability. growth is valued at a much lower rate. In fact, when you look at companies that are being sold, the valuations are being based not on a multiple of growth now, but a multiple of profits. And so these challenges have now become really acute for subscription businesses. Again, we see that customer acquisition has slowed, it's become more expensive, which has meant that creating profit growth, what is being demanded on companies now, is doubly challenging. We have slower growth rate, higher cost to acquire customers, and higher churn rates. And of course, the subscription business model is based on the idea of the longer you retain a customer, the longer you have to be able to earn back the acquisition cost. And so as the cost of acquisition has increased, that payback period to try to reach break even on your customers gets longer and longer as well, also exacerbating the difficulty in delivering profits. So what we want to be able to look at now is, with these demands on businesses to grow profits, what are the mechanisms that subscription businesses can have? What levers can they push and pull to be able to deliver on this goal? So it probably makes sense for us to stop for a minute and just talk about why the subscription business model is so desirable to businesses. And it really is based on the idea that for a transactional merchant, a customer that's selling to businesses or to consumers, when they're asking the customer to come back and make episodic purchases, you have to invest in acquiring the customer, most likely, try to find them and tell them why you have a product that they want to buy. And then you have to market them continuously and give them offers and promotions, get them to come back and buy a feed when they're ready. And that becomes very expensive. Now, the subscription model also requires, in fact, many times, usually a larger acquisition cost, but that consumer continues to bill with you over and over, right? So that the retention and the life cycle of that customer, there's a cycle where they continuously get products and services from you and they bill. And so as they use the product and service, it continues to deliver revenue for you. And at some point, as the cost of acquisition is reached, what happens is that you now reach break even on that customer. And it's really important to recognize, because I think everybody knows this intuitively, but sometimes it gets forgotten, that literally all the profits that are made by subscription businesses are being delivered by customers that have recouped their acquisition costs. Every single profit dollar is coming from those customers. So now we come to the question of, within subscription businesses, why is it so hard to optimize retention? Are subscription businesses that are based on this idea that we need to recoup the cost of a customer acquisition, that cost, and then keep those customers billing as long as possible to keep the delivery of profit dollars as long as possible, becomes incredibly important. And so we know that every subscription business values retention. They know it's important, but are there constraints that we see within subscription businesses that get in the way? And the answer we found is, unfortunately, a very big yes. So typically within subscription businesses, the leaders of the retention and the customer experience practices own responsibility for those programs that increase retention, because the assumption is that the only source of churn is customers choosing to cancel their subscription. Now, the reality is that there's two kinds of churn. There's voluntary churn and there's involuntary churn. And we'll dive into that in a minute. But the first part I wanted to make a point about is really crucial for something that seems so obvious, but it turns out is more subtle and it's hard to understand. When we started this conversation, we talked about the fact that a lot of transactional businesses started with selling single transactions to their customers, episodic purchases, and they've migrated to a subscription model. And in the same way, the old method of accounting and finance, of how to track the profitability and the accounting of a company, was based on that old transactional model. But we're trying to use that to manage and optimize subscription businesses. And what we found is that, unfortunately, the traditional accounting methods, the accounting statements, the profit and loss statement, and income statement, actually don't provide the tools to properly calculate the revenue and profit delivery that increase in retention delivers. There's indirect ways you can measure it, but there's no direct way to be able to look at specific increases in retention and see the very, very large leverage impact it has, particularly on profit growth. And what that means, of course, is that if there are not effective ways to measure the benefits and the outcomes of retention-based programs, then the prioritization and the evaluation of these efforts that are made in companies are not measured properly. And often we find that they're underinvested in or not tackling all the source of churn because the understanding of what the harm or the value that can be unlocked is not really measured or accounted for. That's number one. So that is a accounting issue. And then secondly, is really more organizational in nature, where again, the people that own the role of retention and customer, both reduction in churn and customer retention, often focus on voluntary churn or customers canceling. And what they don't recognize is that there are other sources of churn, what we call involuntary churn, which is customer losses that are driven by payments problems. And what I meant by the organizational problem is often the companies will look at the payment system, how the billing system works to continuously, month after month, billing period after billing period, bill your customers for the products or services they're getting, is a back office operation. It's often owned by finance or operations or even some of the bigger companies that recognize the importance of payments, have created payments teams. But the ability to be able to push in the traditional efforts and strategies around churn, which is optimizing for retention, are not reflected in these programs. So we'll get into that a little bit, explain that in more detail, but I want to lay those two concepts with you. So as we go through the explanations and the guidance of how to solve these are clear. Okay, so this is gonna be a fun example. This is where we get into the accounting. Hopefully you'll be able to look at this the same way that I do, which is, this is fun. So we're gonna go through a sample company and we're gonna go through 3 different scenarios. So most subscription companies will say, we want to improve our metrics, we want to improve profits and revenue, and they'll either focus on growth or focus on retention. They may try to do both. We're going to look at each individual approach separately in order to be able to make our point and make the difference in numbers easier to understand. So our sample company is typically, for what we see, that they have 42,000 active customers. They charge $60 every billing period. That results in $2.5 million in revenue per month. We see, and based on our customers, that typically the cost to acquire a customer is usually 4, 5, 6 billing periods. So we're assuming that this customer has a customer acquisition of $230 or just under 4 billing periods. I think this probably will ring true for your business as well. And this business is operating at a level where their new customer acquisition is slightly outpacing their churn. So they're growing new customers at 18% a month, but they're churning out customers at 16% per month. So they're staying slightly positive on the growth side. So let's look at their accounting. Oops, excuse me. So flat growth model, and we can look at the next 4 quarters. You'll see that every quarter, their revenue grows a little bit because, again, their acquisition is outpacing their churn. But you see the losses and then from churn, new customers being added, and the monthly revenue growth. In this business, their COGS, or cost of goods sold, are flat because that's the cost to deliver the products. They do deliver a physical good, which have a higher gross margin rate of 60%. And as we go down the bottom, the sales and marketing costs are the cost where we incur the cost of acquisition. So the slightly growing numbers in sales and marketing is reflecting the fact that they continue to grow at 18% a month. The G&A, the general administrative costs, are flat and fixed because regardless of how many customers they have, they have the same back-end costs. And their business is operating at a slight loss. So in fact, their rate now, because they are still churning at such a high rate, their net profit has actually grown. The net loss has grown from Q1 of this year to 1.35 million, and it's growing to 4.4 million. So this company's not in great shape. They're not entirely healthy, but they're trudging along. Now, let's say this company puts in a new program working to increase their investment in new customer acquisition, and they want to increase their acquisition by 20%. We're going to make a simplified assumption, assume that we're starting at the same point, 42,000 customers, still $60 billing. But what we're going to assume is that their cost of acquisition is flat. Now, I think it's probably being a little bit generous because often companies will find that as they try to acquire more customers, it's going to cost them a little bit more. But let's assume in this case that their cost of acquisition is still just $230, but they're increasing their acquisition rate from 18% a month in the prior example to 22% a month now. So there's 20% growth rate, and their monthly churn rate is staying fixed at 16%. So let's see what happens to their financials And you assume that, of course, the revenue will go up, but let's see what happens to their profits. So what we see is that their beginning revenue stays the same, but by the end of Q4, based on that cumulative growth of a 20% monthly growth rate, that by Q4, their revenue has increased from their steady state growth, which was 9.4 million. Now they're billing $14.374 million per month. So the 20% growth rate monthly is now translated to 52% growth in revenue. Looks impressive, right? The COGS, of course, the cost to deliver those sales has increased quite a bit because they're servicing more customers, but because the gross margin rate is fixed, they're still the gross margin still remains 60%. Now we go down a little bit lower, and the G&A is still flat, right? They have not added any bottom line costs. Again, we're being generous with the recognition, but you'll see that their sales and marketing, the cost of acquisition has jumped dramatically. It's gone from 6.3 million all the way up to 11.4 million, or an 80% growth. And so what you see is that adding on of customer acquisition costs now has actually taken their net profit, where before they were by the end of Q4, they're just at a 1.5 million quarterly loss. That has increased to 3.6 million quarterly loss. I think that's probably counterintuitive to think that driving more customers will lower profits, actually drive more costs. But the reality is that cost of acquisition, remember we talked about at the beginning that every customer is acquired is not going to drive profit dollars until the cost of acquisition is recouped. And so we're seeing is that direct translation on the accounting statements that as you layer on more acquisition costs, that you're actually increasing your losses because those customers have not delivered any profits yet. We're still recouping the cost of acquisition. Now let's look at scenario number 3. And this is where this gets really fun. So we're saying that we'll look at the same company, and our goal now is to increase the retention by 20%. Let's assume that they've recognized that their voluntary churn efforts, their interventions and customer cancellations, and trying to improve their customer experience have plateaued. They've reached the end of their effectiveness, and so they're going to focus on involuntary churn. They're going to focus on their failed payments, which is the churn caused by payment declines, as the way to measure retention gains. Coincidentally, that's what FlexPay does, is recover failed payments. This is what we deliver in value. But of course, this example plays out for every retention effort. So in this example, we're going to increase customer acquisition. We're going to keep customer acquisition flat, which means our gross margin rate is still unchanged, right? We're still, gross margin is still 60%. Our operating expenses are unchanged. And of course, our customer acquisition is not going to increase either. So this is where this becomes kind of fun. So let's look at this customer. So what we're saying is that their customer acquisition rate goes back to the original 18%. Their monthly churn rate, again, is at the beginning of 16%. What we're changing here is that we're adding in a failed payment recovery solution. We're going to say that of their total churn, 50% was being caused by failed payments, which is very normal what we see with businesses. And that FlexPay will be able to deliver 25% recovery on those failed payments. We'll charge just 15% recovery fee in the month of recovery. And what that does is it drops the monthly churn rate from 16% down to 14%. Think about that. A 25% recovery rate on failed payments with the assumptions we built in is actually lowering their churn rate from 16% down to 14%, or 12.5% reduction in churn. We're also going to assume that, this is also examples of what we see with our customers, that once a customer is recovered, they continue to bill for 4 months after recovery. So this has a dramatic change on our financial statements. We see now that our revenue continues to go up because we're recovering customers and keep them longer. In fact, we can isolate now on how much revenue is being recovered each month from recovery customers. We still see some customer acquisition, which are 18% growth rate. And as we start to go down, we see that our revenue has gone up dramatically to 20 million. Our gross margin remains at 60%. What we see, the biggest impact we see compared to the growth rate scenario, is that our sales and marketing dollars have dropped dramatically, which means that now we've actually, by increasing churn, have not grown net losses. We've actually shrunk net losses down to the point where we're almost break even for this business. So we're generating a lot more revenue, but it's a lot more profitable revenue because we're not burning the cost of acquisition to deliver this revenue. That's why the impact, the financial leverage is created by increasing retention is so huge. So here's a summary chart we'll be able to go through and look at the three scenarios. So in the first scenario, which is flat growth or slight growth, in month 12, after 12 months, we had 53,000 active customers. And this is what becomes so fascinating. What we see is that when we focus on retention improvements, not only do we get revenue growth, we actually generate more active customers billing than we did with a 20% revenue customer growth model. So under 20% growth, we have 84,000 active customers, but by retaining customers, by reducing involuntary churn and keeping them around for the 4 months after 12 months, we have almost 100,000 customers billing. The revenue actually is higher as well. So the revenue goes from the steady state of 9.4. It surpasses the revenue from customer growth. Again, think about that. Increasing retention at a rate slower than customer growth assumption actually generates more revenue. So we have 16.5 million in revenue. And because we have a lower sales and marketing cost, the lower cost of acquisition, we drop a lot more dollars to the bottom line. So when our starting point was a negative 16% profit margin, because of the cost of acquisition increases, that jumped to 25% negative results for 20% customer growth scenario. But with 50% increase in retention improvements, that drops down to just a -4 rate, or almost break even. So that's the leverage that's created. Increasing retention generates more revenue, but it does it in a dramatically more profitable way. And so we talk about what impact we can have. Remember, the thesis of this presentation was that if we want to impact profit growth this year, there's only one path to get there. And this is the physical demonstration of that with the financial process, the financial statements, that investing in customer growth will grow revenue, but the cost of acquisition will outpace the percentage of revenue growth, which leads to higher losses. But if we increase retention by a meaningful amount, or even a 15% amount, we increase revenue and we decrease the cost compared to acquisition, which means we impact net profits. Very powerful stuff. So let's talk about involuntary churn. As I said before, involuntary churn is caused by failed payments or declined payments, as every billing period you're submitting payments to your banks or the banks that issue the cards. And sometimes they're declined. Sometimes it's truly fraudulent cards, or they are canceled. Most often they're called false declines. Unfortunately, most times in companies, the payments tech stack or the system that operates payments is owned by finance or operations or even a specialized payments team. And because it's viewed as an operational process, the payment problems are also viewed as transactions or processing failures. So typically the first step in solving that companies will take is they'll build a retry solution, right? If the logic is sound, like if my payment fails, I'll just resubmit it over and over again to try to get to clear, which delivers some value. It's a good first step. The second option is, okay, if I have payments or decline, it must be my customer's problem. So I'm going to send all these customers that experience a failed payment to my customer support team and have them send them out, and they will reach out to the customers and treat it as a collections problem or try to get card updates. And that's one of the problems we see often with companies. Well, these solutions will help, they'll provide better results than no solution. Because they are looking at this as a transactional problem versus a customer problem, it leads to mistakes in how and under delivery of what the potential is from unlocking involuntary churn gains. And often when you're interacting with customers, if it's not treated with extreme care, what you're harming is the customer satisfaction, recovery results, and retention. Because I think we've all experienced a failed payment, and every time that a customer is exposed to failed payment, that experience is inherently negative. It's going to be a bad brand experience. We have data from our customer research. We surveyed hundreds of consumers experience failed payments, and universally it was viewed as, if I have a payment that if I give my card to a switching company and I'm told now that my payment failed, it harms my experience, it harms my satisfaction with your brand. And the question often comes up is, my card works everywhere else. Why is it failing with you? It must be your problem, not mine. And of course, those consumer feelings, those business feelings, their customer problems lead to unwillingness to solve the problem and also churn. So the best practices that we advocate for in our solution is built around is based on the the strategy that we want to view the failed payment problems as a customer issue and should be viewed as a customer experience opportunity to optimize. So we really want to treat the declined payment as really a critical customer experience moment. The best experience is that if we can recover the payment directly with the failed payment, with the payment system, without involving the customer, without creating any awareness on their part that the payment has failed, then they're better off, and we both get the, we allow the subscription to keep billing, and the customer experience is not damaged in any way, shape, or form. The customer satisfaction is not harmed. We know, of course, that not all payments can be solved this way, and sometimes the customers do have to be involved. So creating a very carefully crafted experience that engages with your customers, to interact with them, to be able to communicate with them in a way that's very positive, avoid creating these negative reactions where the customer views that they're being accused of causing a problem, is really, really vital. We want to make sure that we're delivering an experience that will find a way to navigate that customer's emotions and result in them choosing to interact with us to fix the problem and to walk away with a high level of satisfaction. And that's what our engaged experience solution exactly is built around, powered by behavioral science to deliver these outcomes. So in conclusion, to restate this title of this program, the reality is that the only path that you have to increasing your company profits and your free cash flow this calendar year is to increase retention. Growing revenue by acquiring more customers generates large amounts of customer acquisition costs, which offsets the revenue and leads to higher levels of losses. You still have options to raise your prices to increase the revenue per customer, but of course, you work within a competitive environment, often leads to more churn as customers simply choose not to work with you or to go to a competitive solution. Trying to reduce the cost of goods sold is very difficult. Often that's very fixed. And so there's very few levers you have to be able to deliver this outcome. But increasing retention is crucial. And the reality is that when you think about your business, most likely you already have a fair amount of efforts in place to reduce what we, again, involuntary churn and customer cancellations. So the quickest path you have to increase retention is to tackle and solve your involuntary churn, reduce this. Now, over and over and over again, with all of our customers, we found that by launching with FlexPay and reducing the involuntary churn, whether you have a solution in place or not, whether it's completely new to you, either way, we will be able to increase your failed payment recovery, reduce your involuntary churn, and very dramatically increase not only revenue, but more importantly, a leverage benefit to your bottom line profit dollars. This will be the single largest gain in customer retention you can unlock, and it'll be the biggest driver of profit growth your subscription business can deliver this year. I guarantee it. So that brings me to the end of our structured presentation. So we do have some time for some questions and answers. Let's see if anybody has asked a question in the chat. Feel free, if you do have a question, to use the chat box, and I will get back to you either during the session or follow up with you afterward. So we do have a question from Tom. Tom asks, just for going back and comparing the differences in profits by growing customers and acquiring more customers, increasing your acquisition rate versus increasing retention. I think that if you want to learn more, there is an additional asset we have on the desktop here. You can download a booklet that talks directly to this in more detail. There's also a booklet on the dashboard that talks about the customer experience and ways to think about your organizational design and the people that should be involved to help solve this problem. But the simple answer is that when you acquire customers, let's use an example of your customer acquisition costs, again, $60, and your customer acquisition costs are $230, you're billing $60 a month. For every customer you acquire, it's going to take you almost 4 months just to break even on that customer. So as you acquire more customers, you're stacking up this acquisition debt where you have to not only maintain retention for all those customers past 4 months, that 4-month acquisition payback cycle, to even break even on those customers. Some of your customers may drop off at 2 months, which means that the customers that are left over now have to bill out 6 months to break even on that group of acquisition. So that's the way it plays out, that you have a lag between the revenue gains and when you see profits, because of that need to be able to recoup the cost of acquisition. And that's where the subscription model is so attractive, because of the ongoing series of purchases that accrue. The cost of acquisition does make the short-term recovery of the customers and turning the acquisition dollars into profits at best delayed and at worst challenging, particularly in environments where the cost of acquisition is increasing. Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's presentation. Thank you very much for joining. I will stay online for a couple more minutes. If you want to use a chat and ask questions, please feel free. I really want to thank you for attending. This probably might be perceived as a little bit of a complicated topic, but the story is so important for you to understand the drivers of profitability, which align now with what the business demands are to deliver profits from your business, are so important to understand. And the fact that we can present you with a tool that will literally from day one increase your retention rates, increase profit, and have a dramatic impact on profits is such a liberating insight to be able to own that this is not out of your control. This is something you can take ownership of today and fix today and deliver those profit gains your business is demanding. So with that last word, thank you very much.